what I want to talk about today. We're going to leave the rest of democracy for Wednesday and then Monday. The purpose of the Wiarda reading is to sort of highlight the quest for coming up with a grand theory of things. You know, a theory of everything. Now, grand theory is by itself just simply a term that social scientists like to use to kind of utilize as the synchronon theory for explaining everything. There are different theories that go into grand theory, right? Grand theory is sort of like the overarching thing. What exactly is the most popular attempt at grand theory? This is where we begin. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was modernization, and modernization was with political science. All right, this is where we begin. In the beginning was modernization. Modernization theory has been really one of the cornerstones, not only of comparative politics, but theories of democracy and good governance, and theories of democratic transition. And if you really want to get even more specific about where does it all begin, there are very few articles that have been written within the political science field that have been regarded with such awe, reverence, and head-scratching, because usually the two come together, as Seymour Martin Lipset's magnum opus, Some Social Requisites of Democracy, which was published in the 1959 edition of the American Political Science Review. Now, the APSR is the major journal of political science research. And it's sort of understood that if you get published in the APSR, you're going places in poli-sci. The downside is that nobody reads the APSR. Okay? They said maybe like 5 people. Okay? So your goal is to get published for an audience of nobody, but you know, the APSR is what it is now. Not to knock the APSR back then, Lipset's article is very, very important for a number of reasons. One of which is that Lipset's article generated more, let's say, additional studies, more inquiries, more research agendas than pretty much any article, any study since. The only other article, the only other study that maybe gives Lipset's article a run for its money is the famous, infamously famous, and famously infamous Clash of Civilizations by Sam Huntington. By the way, how many of you have heard of Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations? If you were in my politics and culture class, you'd better. Okay? But Huntington's article was published in the early 90s. And Lipset's article was published at the end of the 50s, but had already been seen as veritable gospel in the decade prior. So what exactly is modernization theory? The TLDR version of it is that the more modernized a country is, the more likely the country is to develop democracy. Right? Lipset's article, which is about 40, 50 pages, effectively says modernization yields democracy. Democracies are modern countries. They are developed countries. They are countries with some type of industrial economic system. They embody the principles of market capitalism. And most importantly, Lipset was not the first person to coin this, but at this point it was pretty much obvious. There's a certain segment of society that is absolutely vital. A certain economic class that is absolutely vital for a democracy to manifest. What is this ultimately so important economic class? What do you think? The middle class, absolutely. Why the middle class? What makes the middle class so bloody important for fostering a democracy? Why not the upper classes? Why not the lower classes? What makes the middle class so important? Okay, so this is actually an interesting thing. This is something that really describes some of the foundations of real structural democratic literature, to which Lipset is included, Robert Dahl is included, Barrington Moore is included, among others. And the explanation is very aptly as follows. The middle class has a certain degree of political power, and they use that power as a way of safeguarding a number of provisions. The middle class comes to power through a market economy. The middle class are a certain type of wage earners. They earn their money, they earn their fortune not through inheritance, not through titles, but through generated income, through industry, through commerce, through businesses. And in that regard, they rely on a bi-weekly paycheck. And it's a very simple thing. As long as I get paid, I don't riot. The middle class are those people that enter into political debates and create safeguards for not only their earnings, but also to ensure that the state relies upon a constant flow of incoming money through the, and we call this as what? Taxes, that go towards providing state services. The wealthy just want to hoard it all to themselves, and the poor, well, sad but true, no money, no voice. The middle class, therefore, are those that invest in the state. They invest in roads, in hospitals, in schools. They invest in higher education. They are skilled labor. They are an educated class. They are a literate class. They do not hold aristocratic titles, and they don't have vast tracts of land that they can just simply live off of. No, they're wage earners. And as such, they are the ones that, whether they know it or not, are churning the gears of modernization and development. So Lipset effectively says the end result is clear. If you look at a country that has a developed economic system, a developed industry system, a developed education system, a developed civil society, right, all of these things are indicative of the idea that there is a middle class. And as such, the country is modern, and more often than not, the country is democratic. Rich countries are democratic. Poor countries are not. The countries that are democratic are small, and they tend to be gravitated in the developed part of the world. By the way, when we're talking about modernity breeds democracy, which countries do you think Lipset has in mind? Great Britain, United States, France, Switzerland, Italy on a good day, West Germany, very good, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. You got to remember, this is the 1950s. So there are still governments, there are still ideologies that are counter to democracy. There's communism, and there's various forms of dictatorships ranging from tribalism to, my God, Franco is still fascist. Okay? The understanding here is, look, it is the 1950s. So he is looking at correlation. He is saying, I'm looking at the democracies around the world and I see the same thing. Develop, 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 develop. Good for you, Protestant Reformation. Good for you, Protestant work ethic. Okay? Now, this becomes gospel. This is like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. Okay? And this is, kind of like rammed into all the graduate seminars for a new generation of political scientists that are going to school around this time, and they're kind of learning the ropes. Because remember, comparative politics started out as comparative political systems. And which countries are we really going to study? Or again, we're talking about the 40s and 50s. Which countries actually have developed political systems? The very ones that we just mentioned. And oh, look at that, they happen to be democratic. Now, there are countries out there that are developed, but they're not democratic. The Soviet Union for one, China for another. Oh, by the way, Japan is also thrown into the exclusive club. Okay? But here's the thing. After a while, we kind of saturate the field by looking at the same countries. And there's only so much you can write about Great Britain. There's only so much you can write about Switzerland and the United States. There's a whole wider world out there. And by the 1950s, there's a major global event that's happening. Decolonization. Okay? British Empire, quite possibly one of the only empires in history to kind of go gracefully. Empires don't go gracefully. They kind of go kicking and screaming. Or they just, fight to the last man to the invading Ottomans or whatever. Great Britain was like, oh, we're the greatest empire in the world, and oh, well, that was fun, jolly good game. Right? And so the British Empire is breaking up. The French Empire goes kicking and screaming. The Belgian Empire. Yes, Belgium actually had a colonist, if you can believe it. Okay? Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, and the rest. Which now opens up pretty much most of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. In fact, the only region of the world that was closed off still was Eastern Europe. And why? Because of the Soviet Union, right? You just couldn't go. Okay? But the rest of the world is basically open up. Now, here was the $64,000 question within political science at the time. Okay? Of all the countries that are now coming onto the map, Ghana, South Korea, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, you name it. Which ones are likely to become democratic? And which ones are not? Using what you've learned in your seminars about modernization theory. So these grad students, they go through all their classes, they do all their papers, and when it's time for them to write their PhDs, they are sent out into the world on their study abroad things, and they're sent to wherever they want to go, Latin America, Africa, you name it, with the idea of come back in a year or two with your findings. Which countries are likely to transition and which ones are not. Okay? And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but 2 to 5 years later, when these grad students were coming back and writing their dissertations, 90% of the countries under study were given a negative or at best inconclusive rating. Inappropriate for democracy, not likely to develop, no sense of modernity whatsoever. But you kind of see where I'm going with this, right? India, Israel, Turkey, Japan after the Second World War, right? They all get passes because what they do is they either abandon pre-existing cultural traits and patterns for modern Western patterns of development, or they somehow find a way of making the two coexist. In almost all other countries, the answer was inconclusive or negative. Okay? Now, at some point, you have to think to yourself, okay, if 90% of the countries under research came back negative, is the world that screwed up? Or perhaps, this is something that social scientists in general, and political scientists in particular, hate to acknowledge. Or maybe my theory isn't entirely correct. Now, political scientists will basically go to no effort, will go to no end to defend their theories, no matter how screwed up it is. And so instead of realizing, hey, you know what, maybe 90% of the countries coming back inconclusive means that your theory is kind of wrong. No, my theory cannot be wrong. I'm a political scientist. Okay? I like to make fun of my own discipline. We are very stubborn individuals. But it was dawning on people by the 60s, by the 70s, that, perhaps modernization theory is asking things or looking for criteria that aren't so much deficient, but just simply don't exist. Now, does that make the country deficient? Or does that make your theory somehow biased? Now, in the Wiarda article, he mentions Peter Winch, who, among other things, Peter Winch and Alistair McIntyre, these are two social scientists that made their name by basically critiquing everything and everyone in the discipline. And Peter Winch sort of said, or sort of offhand, it's in the reading, that perhaps, just perhaps, modernization theory, which was designed around developed countries in Western Europe, and then applied to developing countries in other parts of the world, are really a case of applying apples to oranges, right? Or in this case, you're not even applying apples to oranges. Apples to oranges is fine. What we're doing here is applying apples to patio furniture. Okay? So you're looking for criteria that just doesn't exist because it's in a different part of the world. And how are you expecting to find a developed middle class in a country that was a colony for over 100 years? Right? I mean, isn't it sort of silly to look at one of the most developed countries in the world, Great Britain, and then apply that to Ghana and be like, oh my God, look at what's wrong with Ghana. Well, no shit, Sherlock. I mean, this is Great Britain, this is Ghana. I mean, come on. The other problem that came about with this is that the inconclusive studies also regarded that there were these other things that got in the way. Silly, annoying little things like culture, language, religion, all sorts of things that the West either tamed or put in the galleries of museums. They no longer matter. Separation of church and states. The adoption of secular republicanism. Due process. A social contract. A constitution. Universities. All these things. And so critiques of modernization theory by the 70s began to understand that maybe it's not culture that gets in the way, but that culture does matter. And yes, here's a reality that kind of bucks the trend of theory, because if you spend too much time in theory, you kind of forget how the rest of the world works. Again, go back to what's the matter with Kansas. Yes, Virginia, culture does matter. Identities do matter. Religion matters. Languages matter. Animosities matter. Legacies matter. And sometimes they matter more than democracy. That doesn't mean that they're anti-democratic. It just means that there's things that are more important right now. And if your idea of how does a country become democratic effectively is the more they're like Great Britain, the more they'll be democratic. Well, lots of luck trying to get countries to do that. Okay? So in many cases, what I'm trying to say is that culture is not so much going to get in the way, but culture is what makes people identify themselves with. Not everybody is going to abandon Hinduism for the Church of England. Okay, maybe there's like one disaffected Buddhist out there that's like, dude, I'm so sick of this metaphysics. I want hardcore rational thinking C of E. Okay? But other than that, it's not going to happen. Probably one of the best critiques about modernization theory's grand theory application was from a 1971 article by Giovanni Sartori, who coined the phrase conceptual stretching. I love this term. We can be a dry discipline, but every so often we come up with some really neat things. Conceptual stretching, Sartori postulates, is one of the biggest problems in political science methodology. In so many words, conceptual stretching is a result of erroneous conclusions that are reached by applying criteria, listen to me, by applying criteria that was proven for one case. But you take that criteria and you now try to apply it to a whole bunch of other cases and see if it works. Now you might get lucky and it may work one of the times. More often than not, you apply the criteria for one set of cases to the rest of the world. Well, no wonder it's not going to work. Okay? The problem with conceptual stretching, if I can make it a little bit more user-friendly for you all, try running a program designed for a Mac on Windows. And see if you don't get the blue screen of death. Right? Try running something designed for one operating system on another. This is not going to work. Okay? Conceptual stretching is making conclusions based upon pre-existing data, but then applying those same criteria to another set, whether or not that data exists. Does that make sense? Right? Does that make sense? What Sartori is saying is that you are going to the developing world looking for modernization that you came up with from the developed world. That just simply doesn't work. Okay? At the absolute least, take history into account. If you're gonna at least apply this criteria, can you at least apply the criteria of modernization from these core countries maybe 200, 300 years ago? You're expecting, and this is also something that still kind of resonates within the policy world today. Every so often an authoritarian regime is overthrown, and we don't do this as much as we used to. You'd be surprised how recent we did. The statue of the dictator is toppled on Monday, and we're expecting full democratic consolidation, multi-party elections, and a Green Party to take part in political consensus building by Friday. And if we don't see that, the Muslims just don't know anything about democracy. You'd be surprised the crap that you can hear on TV. And I'm not just talking about Fox News. That just runs across the board. Okay? The other thing we have to take into account is that even those countries in the developed world took very different transition paths to get to where they were. Great Britain took about 600 years to get to where it was by 1950. Germany took a world war or two in order to get to where it was. And Japan took an atomic bomb or two to get to where it was. And let's also be honest, 1959, America was considered to be a developed democracy, but was it a consolidated democracy? Was it a social democracy? 1959, you still had people who could get lots of votes running for office on the platform, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Let's also remember this is the 1950s. There were parts of this country where there were signs that said, whites only. So tell me, how developed is your democracy? Are you just looking at structural configurations? Well, if you are, that's the Wikipedia easy way. Are you looking for more attitudinal preferences to democracy? Well, in that case, those countries that you consider to be democratic, you can cut them in half and take some of the smaller ones as the ones that work. But of course, as I said, political scientists tend to really hold on to their theories because, damn it, I published something and my name is next to it. I will not have my name besmirched. They're going to defend this to the death. So, of course, modernization theory takes a major hit to the face with Vietnam. Because the Vietnam War, more than just simply a tactical loss for the United States, was the first time a country demonstrated to the world media that it did not want America's style of governance. And it chose something else. At the end of the day, the Vietnam War was basically that. Okay, the Vietnam War was to get the Vietnamese to finally say, okay, we'll take marching orders from Washington as opposed to Moscow. The defeat of American diplomatic interests in Vietnam kind of threw us, and again, the 1970s was somewhat of a weird time for us. Fashion was horrible, disco was around, the economy was tanking. New York was probably affordable to live in, but, very affordable, though you wouldn't want to live there. If you said you were going to Times Square in 1975, I did not want to know what you were doing. My point is that by the 1970s, in the wake of the Vietnam era, it had now, defenders of modernization theory have now reworked their theory into, well, it's not so much that culture gets in the way, but there are just societies and there are just parts of the world that are just simply incompatible with democracy. Right? We just kind of retcon the whole thing. Well, the Vietnamese didn't want democracy anyway. What do they know? They're a bunch of rice-picking Asians. What do they know about democracy? Just like those, vodka-drinking Russians and those, starving Chinese, whatever it is. What do they know? They don't know anything about democracy. And that kind of breeds a whole new level of political science, which comes to conclude that perhaps democracy isn't exactly a global phenomenon, but perhaps it is specific to the West. So to kind of give you a, sort of a little bookmark, okay, so what have we been talking about so far? Political scientists may have begrudgingly admitted, okay, all right, modernization theory may not be grand theory. But modernization theory itself is still good, damn it. May not be grand theory because of the culture. All right, fine. So you know what? That's just fine. Because the Western world will be the beacon of democracy and social contracts and all those types of liberties and freedoms. And the rest of the world can basically go screw itself. This is when Huntington started to think about civilizations clashing. And he didn't really write this down formally for another 20 years or so. But the point is that you may recognize that the theory doesn't work, but you're still going to come up with implausible excuses. Okay? So you're right for all the wrong reasons. Yes, you're right that modernization theory can't really function as a grand theory. But the explanations are very, very insular, and they're also self-serving. What started out as political Eurocentrism, right? Democracy begins in Europe, and it spreads out to the rest of the world, kind of devolves into Western ethnocentrism. The West versus the rest. Okay? Huntington's a big practitioner of this, along with other contemporaries of his own. And even as recent as the years following 9/11, you'd hear people in the State Department in Washington, Foreign Office in London and elsewhere, that have absolutely no problem, and they will not even blink when they effectively say on camera something like, well, not everyone is going to become democratic because their culture either forbids it or makes it impossible. Islam is incompatible with democracy. Orthodox Christianity is incompatible with democracy. Chinese culture is incompatible with democracy. And there are a few countries that are non-Western that finally get their act together. South Korea finally gets its act together in the 1980s. But why? Not because of South Korean culture, but because South Korea does what Japan does. Let's just go completely crazy consumer Western nutball. So whereas Japan kind of did its own thing, there's a whole new phenomenon in South Korea today. I'm sure some of you have heard about it. It's called K-pop. And nothing says modernization like K-pop. And you compare the music that's coming out of North Korea versus South. North Korean music, I absolutely adore. Want to know why? Because North Korean music sounds like it's perpetually 1943 Soviet Union. They all sound like they are actually trained to sing and sound like a Russian choir. Okay, like you can listen to stuff that's coming out of North Korea today and think, my God, is this like World War II era? No, this shit was published in 2015. Awesome. Okay, and then just across the DMZ, you've got Gangnam Style. Okay? So in a way, modernization theory is still like, yeah, hi, look at South Korea today, yo, check that shit out. Back in the 1970s, this was best Korea, this was inferior Korea. In the 2010s, inferior Korea is now super Korea, and best Korea is joke Korea. Okay? Okay. But the point is, the culture changes. Or at least that's what the CNN headlines are going to tell you, right? The culture changes. Become like America. Become like the West. Get rid of your tea ceremonies, all that other jazz. Okay? Another element of this, which I don't want to spend too much time on now, because we'll get to it throughout the semester, but I talk about it a little bit more in my politics and culture class, which if everything works according to plan, I will be teaching again in the fall, is this understanding among the defenders of modernization theory that, okay, maybe paths of development may be different here, but certain paths of development created certain institutional and historical circumstances that led one group of people to reach democracy and another group of people to reach something else. So what was it that led to democracy? Well, let's see. Well, there are these things like the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation and the scientific and industrial revolutions. This all fits very nicely with modernization theory because these are the building blocks that create a middle-class society. Of course, the advent of the free market, Adam Smith's wealth of nations, social contracts, separation of church and state, right? This begets this does this does this does this does this, right? So it's a very nice process tracing that shows how Western Europe kind of started getting its act together around 1500 and has been an alpha ever since. And all of Western Europe's successful spin-offs, Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand, prove that point. So it's a nice way of showing that the West has been the best since the year 1500, roughly around 1500, when all of this stuff started. The rest of the world didn't have this. So, okay, your culture is whatever it is, but you never had a Renaissance. You never had a scientific revolution. You never had an enlightenment. You never had separation of church and state. So the Sam Huntingtons and the Fareed Zakarias, a big fan of Sam Huntington, the Lipsets and others, are now following this cultural argument that says, okay, one set of cultural patterns created democracy while other things created something else. Okay, maybe nice. This is where I step into the equation. Why? Because I'm teaching the damn class. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, that's all fine and good. But based on this evidence, there never really was a grand theory. Right? I'm just going to come flat out and say, the search for a grand theory is elusive because there cannot be a grand theory. And there never was a grand theory. We tried with modernization, and it maybe worked for a little bit, but after a while, when your answers are coming back inconclusive, you have to kind of think maybe the formula doesn't entirely work. You just can't shove a round peg into a square hole and think that it's going to work. Okay? And trust me, no one's going to follow the math in the APSR. The other thing to take into account, and this is a little bit more pragmatic, what we regarded as grand theory was somewhat premature because it was based on only a small handful of advanced industrialized countries. And it is somewhat ballsy to call something grand theory when you're only applying it to the developed areas of Europe. You know, if you send your grad students out into the world and it kind of works, well, then you can call it grand theory. You know? It's very Western-centric. And it also precludes and presupposes and biases and prejudices dozens of experiments, dozens of observations. The other problem is that our criteria for modernization was based upon a set of axioms and data sets that, you know, in their own world, in their own mindset, in their own right, are fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, Lipset is not was not, he was a well-respected political scientist. And, you know, as I said, modernization theory, started dozens and dozens of other degrees of research. And if you follow his logic, yes, it makes absolute sense, right? There's nothing wrong with his theory. And Lipset wasn't the one that tried to make a great theory. In many cases, Lipset's name was somehow just attached to this whole thing. Let's make this, around the world type of thing. But the problem is that these criteria have been too rudimentary, especially if you're looking for all sorts of specific things that, if you argue, are product of certain historical circumstances. Well, then why are you applying this criteria to the world that you know it didn't exist in other places? Am I making sense? You all following me here? Okay, what is often I have to stop and ask, because this makes sense in my head, but that doesn't mean that it makes sense in yours, trust me. And here's the other thing. You got to also remember, this is the 50s, the 60s. What's going on in the world? What's going on in the world?
Cold War.
Cold War. We have an agenda to push. We have a product to sell. What's the product? Democracy. Very good. Okay? That's the candy coating shell. That's what's inside. Capitalism. We have capitalism to sell. There's a cynic. Very good. At the end of the day, what won the Cold War? Thomas Jefferson or Adam Smith? Adam Smith. Thomas Jefferson kind of got second place, maybe a participation trophy. Adam Smith won the Poli. You got to also remember what variation of Karl Marx are we going after? We're going after political Karl Marx. We're going after economic Karl Marx. We're going after economic Karl Marx. It's always economics. It's the Cold War. And if you read some of these earlier scholarly journals, they have a very obvious agenda set to them, right? We're going out into the world as veritable Amway salesmen, Jehovah's Witness people, knocking on the door. Excuse me, are you interested in democracy? Because you know who is right behind us, or who just came to the door? Hey, pretty fast. Would you like to know about this thing called communism? Okay? Well, you think Khrushchev was sitting home doing nothing? You know, you heard of this guy called Che Guevara, right? You know this guy called Fidel Castro. Okay? Communism was pretty, attractive. Okay? Especially in the post-colonial world. So the idea here was, okay, which countries are going to work? Which ones can we do? Which ones can we work with? Foothold here, yada yada. Especially after the Bay of Pigs invasion, especially after Castro went and took Cuba communist. And the idea is, okay, we can't allow this to happen. So we have an agenda to push. So it's natural that we're going to stick with our theory, because again, one other thing that was taking place, again, this is not academic, but again, normative stuff is very important. It's one thing for the academics to argue about democracy. It's another thing for the newspapers and the journalists to argue the world wants democracy more than communism. Gotta remember that. Okay? We're in a battle of souls here, With that in mind, the country didn't want democracy. It wasn't that we blew the sail. It's that they're too dumb to know what to do with it. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know what's in their best interest. So you know what? Let's just not give it to them because they don't need ruin it. Right? Let them ruin communism. Let them not ruin democracy. So this was placed within a normative bias of self-promotion. This is the Cold War, right? So in that regard, we need to constantly remind ourselves that the pursuit of grand theory has much more than just an academic agenda. Okay, so what can we do? Speaking of Cold War, что делать? Right? What is to be done? As Lenin had asked. Well, this is where we kind of go for the rest of the semester. And this is where I kind of critique some of the foundations of political science, even though I have a PhD. And I love teaching. Sometimes I'm really tired of defending it. First thing that we need to do is probably make peace with the fact that we're not really a science. At least not in the classical understanding. You have the natural sciences, which are located in decrepit buildings on Livingston campus, and you have the social sciences, which are located in decrepit buildings on Douglas campus. You have the history department, which is located in a relatively nice building on college. But the big thing about the social sciences and political science was probably like the one that's the closest among their history, sociology, anthropology, and psychology brethren. Political science has been the one like, we're a science, we need to be a science. The natural scientists will always laugh at us and say, that's adorable. You ain't no scientist. Come on, you're making stuff up as you go. And the historians and the anthropologists and the sociologists and the psychologists that, get their wisdom from chakras or whatever it is, are looking at, and positive vibes, and they're looking at political scientists and they're basically saying your feng shui is totally out of whack, mellow out. And in order to get serious here, political science is a useful discipline, but we oftentimes take the science aspect more seriously than the political. Empirical modeling can certainly be practiced. There's no question about it. Okay? And you can draw inferences based upon observable data. It's all fine and good. The first thing we have to recognize is that no two democracies are the same. No two countries are the same. We might be able to come up with, let's say, regional mid-level theories. We might be able to draw some kind of broad-based theory about states and societies of Western Europe, or Southern Europe, or Eastern Europe. We might be able to draw inferences about states in the Middle East and Latin America. And that's all fine and good. It's certainly plausible to find comparable evidence between the development of, let's say, Serbia and Romania, or Chile and Argentina, or France and Germany, India and Pakistan. But you have to take these regional differences into account. You have to take historical circumstance into account. I'm not saying that I'm a historical fatalist. What happened 600 years ago screws you or benefits you? No, it's not the case at all. But there are things that do matter. There are things that do factor in to these equations. And so some will just simply say, well, we need greater regression analysis. We need more rigorous statistics. We need more mathematical quantification. And I just kind of sit there in the room and I say, no, what you need to do is learn Arabic. I don't know. Or learn Spanish. Or better yet, not just learn Arabic and Spanish through Rosetta. Learn the slang. Learn the colloquials. Because that's what gets you to understand what people mean and what people say. Okay? Some argue that we need more regression. Some are regression analysis. Some argue we need more statistical analysis. I think we should just be better historians. I think we should take anthropology into account, sociology into account. Where's the incidental music coming from anyway? It's actually rather nice in my lectures. And so with that in mind, there is this thing within the political science discipline between small n studies and large n. Small n studies are your qualitative things. That's where the history comes in. That's where the slang comes in. That's where understanding what people mean when they say what they do. Okay? And while that's not going to get you the key to all of your answers, it's going to help you understand that culture and that society, I think, a little bit more. Well, there's only so much you can do by kind of expanding these things into ones and zeros. Look, and I'm not knocking the quantitative studies. Quantitativists are, good people in their own selves. Right? I'm pretty certain at one point you're probably going to take a quantitative studies class in political science, and they'll probably tell you that people like me we don't know what the hell they're doing. Right? It's a turf war. But my point is, if grand theory doesn't work, and modernization theory can only take us so far, that brings us back to the question that many of these students were sent out into the world to look for. And that is, can any country in the world become democratic? The preemptive answer to that, using qualitative studies, is yes. Any country can. Any country. Cuba, yes. Afghanistan, yes. Iraq, yes. Turkey, yes, because it's really not democratic. North Korea, with enough money, funding, time, and alcohol, I will come up with the solution. Can it happen? Absolutely. There's absolutely no country in the world today that is somehow screwed out of democracy. And let's also put it this way, there's no country or no society in the world today that is just by proxy democratic. To be perfectly honest. So that's kind of, where we're going to be going in this place.